This is part 16 of Entity Framework tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss self-referencing association entity framework with database first approach. Let's understand the self-referencing association with an example. We'll be using this employees table for this demo. This employees table is a self-referencing table. That's because to get an employee's manager name, we take the manager ID column value and look up that value in the employee ID column of the same table. For example, to get John's manager name, we look up the manager ID column value, which is 5 here, and then we look up that value in the employee ID column. 5 is Lara, so John's manager is Lara. So this table here is a self-referencing table. Now, when we use entity framework and when we generate an entity model based on this table, we will end up with an employee entity, as you can see here. Notice that there is a self-referencing association that's automatically generated, and there are also two navigation properties, employees1, employee1. Let's look at this in action. So obviously the first step here is to create this table itself, which I have already done, and here is the SQL script that can do it. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have an empty ASP.NET web application project. To this project, let's add an ADO.NET entity data model, and let's call this employee model. And we want to generate a model from the database, so select that option and click Next, and give the connection string a meaningful name. Let's call this employee DB context and click Next. So this should connect to the database and retrieve all the tables, views, and stored procedures. So let's select this employees table and let's give this model namespace a meaningful name. Let's call it employee model and click Finish. So this should generate the employee entity based on the self-referencing employees table. Notice that there is a self-referencing association here, and there are two navigation properties. Now if we right click on this employees1 navigation property and go to its properties, look at that, the multiplicity of the employees1 navigation property is set to many. So this property of the employee object is going to give us multiple employees who are direct reports of a manager. So basically, using this navigation property, we are going to get all the subordinates of a given manager. Okay, and if you look at this property right here, employee1 navigation property, and if you go to its properties, look at the multiplicity. It is 0 or 1. Now if you take an employee may or may not have a manager. For example, if you look at the data that we have right here, Lara has one manager. Similarly, Mark has one manager. But if you look at Ben, he doesn't have a manager. Why? He is the super boss, so he doesn't have a manager. But employees in general directly report to one manager. Typically an employee has got only one manager. Super boss doesn't have a manager. So the relationship here is, the multiplicity here is 0 or 1. So this property is going to return an employee who is a manager. But then look at the names that Entity Framework has auto-generated for these navigation properties. These doesn't really make sense. Now, if we have to write some code based on these navigation property names, then that code will not be readable, and in the longer term, it will not be maintainable as well. Let's actually look at that in action. Let's say, for example, we want to generate an output like this. We want to display employee name and their respective manager name on a web form. So to achieve this, what we would do, we would drag and drop a grid view control, and then we write some link queries. So let's actually flip to Visual Studio. So to this project, let's go ahead and add a web form. And let's drag and drop a grid view control. Let's first of all set the style attribute here. Let's set font family to Arial. Let's drag and drop the grid view control onto the web form, and let's auto format this and choose colorful scheme. Alright, now let's get to the code behind file. So far what we have understood is that employees1 navigation property is going to give us the direct reports or the subordinates, and employee1 navigation property is going to give us the manager employee. Okay, so within the code behind file, we have grid view 1 control, so we're going to set its data source property. So data source equals, we have the employee DB context which is generated. First let's create an instance of employee DB context, and let's call it employee DB context equals new employee DB context. And then we are going to use the DB context object, and it has got obviously employees property, which is going to give us all the employees. Now based on that list, now this employees, okay, we have among these employees list that is returned, we have employees as well as that is subordinates as well as managers. Now we want to produce this output that you see here, employee name and their respective manager name. So to achieve that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to this link expression that we are writing here will be executed on each employee object within this collection. So what we are going to do here is select a new anonymous type. So new type, and let's convert those whatever new types that we generate to a list, and that is set as the data source for the grid view control. And then let's invoke data bind. Okay, so now in this anonymous type, what do we want? We want two columns, two properties basically, employee name and manager name. So employee name equals, so we have the employee object here. So employee object has got employee name property, which is going to return us the name of the employee. And then we also need manager name. So let's call the property manager name. So within the anonymous type that we are building, we are going to have two properties, employee name and manager name. So manager name, how are we going to get the manager name? So this employee object or the employee entity has got employee 1 navigation property. Remember, the multiplicity on that navigation property is 0 or 1. So typically an employee has 1 or 0 managers, right? So that is the property, navigation property, which is going to return the manager of a given employee. So we have the manager employee object, and we are going to use employee name property of it, which will return us the manager name of the given employee. Now with these changes, let's actually run this and see what output we get. Okay, notice that we are getting the output that we expect, employee name, manager name. Now if you look at what we have on the slide, for Ben there is no manager, and it displays this text superboss. So how to get that text? That's straightforward. Here manager name, if this employee 1, what is it returning? It is returning the manager of an employee. But there could be employees who does not have a manager, in which case this employee 1 property, that is the employee 1 navigation property, is going to return null. So if this emp.employee1, if that is going to be null, right, then we want the manager name to be something like Superboss. He doesn't have a manager, so let's call the manager, let's set this text for the manager name column, okay, for that employee. And then if it is not null, then obviously we are going to employee 1 navigation property and then selecting the employee name. So with this change, let's go ahead and run this. So there we get the output that we have seen on the slide. Now if you look at this code, okay, is this readable in the first place? What does this employee 1 means, right? The names that Entity Framework has given to these navigation properties, they're not really meaningful, but Entity Framework has done its best to give those names. So but we can rename them to some meaningful names. So let's flip to employee model here. So employees 1, this is going to return us all the subordinates. So let's call it subordinates. And this navigation property right here, employee 1, this is going to return a manager of an employee. So let's call that manager. Okay, let's save these changes, and then once we go to the code behind file, obviously we are going to have compilation errors because this employee entity no longer has this employee 1 navigation property. Instead, we have renamed that to manager. So if employee's manager is null, that means we don't have a manager for that employee, in which case we want the manager name to be Superboss, On the other hand, if there is a manager, then we want that manager's employee name. Okay, so now if you look at this code is more readable, and obviously if it's more readable, it will be more maintainable as well. Okay, so let's run this and see if we get the same output. So the output is the same, but now we have meaningful names for those navigation properties. And another thing that I want to show you is when you go to the properties of this self-referencing association, notice that there is a referential constraint, and obviously here employees table is mapped to itself. So here the principal is employees table, and the dependent, it has given employees 1, which means it's the same instance of that table, and the principal key here is employee ID, and dependent property is manager ID. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.